You think you know who holds power in a room. The man with the gun, the man with the money, the man who makes people disappear with a phone call. Roman Carrara was that man, 6 feet of tailored menace who ruled his estate like a feudal lord. His word was law, his anger was death. And the quiet maid who refilled his whiskey, she was nothing. A shadow, a servant so beneath his notice that he'd forget her name mid-sentence. He humiliated Ruby Rain because he could, because in his world there were wolves and there were sheep, and she was clearly the latter. He was wrong. The Iron Cartel made their move at 8:47 p.m., a decapitation strike designed to erase Roman Carrara from existence. Explosives at the gate, snipers in the tree line, assault teams moving through his gardens like a plague. His fortress became a death trap in 90 seconds. Roman hit the floor as windows exploded inward. His bodyguard's head snapped back, spraying the antique wallpaper with red. The great Mafia Don, reduced to a panicked animal crawling behind furniture, realized he was about to die in his own home. That's when the maid grabbed him. Her grip was iron. Her movements were combat-trained. She dragged his 200-pound frame to cover like he weighed nothing, then proceeded to perform trauma surgery on his dying guard with hands that had scrubbed toilets that morning. The Black Hawk appeared like an avenging angel, but not for him. When elite soldiers stormed his home, they swept past Roman like he didn't exist. They formed a perimeter around the blood-soaked woman kneeling on his kitchen floor. And when she stood, when she gave orders in a voice that made trained killers snap to attention, Roman Carrara finally understood. The most dangerous person in his house had been cleaning it. This is the story of Commander Ruby Rain, the Wraith, the weapon hiding in plain sight, and the Mafia boss who learned too late that servants see everything. Ruby Rain's day began the way it always did, on her knees. The East Wing corridor stretched before her like a promise of eternity, 200 feet of imported Carrara marble that demanded perfection. She'd learned in the first week that Roman didn't tolerate streaks. He'd made her re-clean an entire hallway because he'd spotted a single watermark, standing over her for 3 hours while she worked, commenting on how even simple tasks seemed beyond people like her. People like her. He said it often, with that particular curl of his lip. The scrub brush moved in steady circles, the sound of bristles against stone creating a rhythm that had become meditation. Invisible. That's what she needed to be. The maid who arrived before the family woke, who disappeared into doorways when footsteps approached, who existed only as evidence of work completed. The perfectly arranged flowers, the spotless glassware, the absence of dust. She heard Roman before she saw him, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the marble she'd finished an hour before. Ruby shifted to the side without looking up, making herself smaller, creating space for him to pass without acknowledging her existence. He stopped. "You missed a spot." His voice carried the lazy cruelty of a man who'd never been contradicted. "There. By the window." Ruby glanced where he pointed. The marble gleamed flawlessly. They both knew it. "Yes, sir. I'll fix it immediately." "See that you do. I'm having important guests tonight. I can't have them thinking I employ incompetence." He paused, and she could feel his gaze on her bowed head. "Although I suppose beggars can't be choosers. Women like you should be grateful for any work at all." "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir." The words tasted like ash, but they kept her invisible. That was all that mattered. Roman moved on, already forgetting her, and Ruby returned to scrubbing marble that didn't need scrubbing. By evening, the mansion had transformed into a stage for power. The dining room glittered with crystal and candlelight, the table set for 12 with china that cost more than most people earned in a year. Ruby moved through the preparations like a ghost, arranging place settings with mathematical precision, ensuring every wine glass caught the light at the perfect angle. The guests arrived in a parade of expensive suits and dangerous smiles. She recognized some of them from the briefings she'd memorized in another life. A shipping magnate with ties to Eastern European arms dealers, a city councilman who'd made 3 corruption investigations disappear, a casino owner whose properties laundered money for 6 different organizations. They handed her their coats without looking at her face, their conversations flowing around her as if she were furniture. "Wine!" Roman commanded as they settled into their seats, and Ruby moved to comply. She poured from left to right, keeping her eyes down, her movements efficient and unremarkable. The conversations washed over her in fragments. "The shipment from Odessa arrives Thursday. The judge has been convinced to reconsider. Our friends in Bogota are requesting additional insurance." Ruby's hands remained steady as she filled each glass. She'd learned to pass information from these dinners, extracting intelligence from boasts and complaints. But tonight felt different. There was tension in the room, an undercurrent of nervousness beneath the usual swagger. "More bread." One of the guests snapped at her, not bothering with please or thank you. Ruby fetched it immediately, placing the basket beside him with practiced subservience. "I still say the Bratva are overstepping," the councilman said, cutting into his steak. "They're moving product through territories that aren't theirs. Let them try." Roman's voice carried absolute confidence. "This estate is a fortress. I have 20 armed men on the grounds. The Russians know better than to challenge me directly." Ruby refilled water glasses, invisible and ignored, while Roman described his security measures in detail. He always did this, treating servants as if they were deaf or too stupid to understand. In 18 months, she'd watched him discuss murders, bribes, and trafficking operations while she cleared plates and poured wine. "You worry too much, Antonio," Roman continued, gesturing with his fork. "The only people who should fear me are those foolish enough to show disrespect." He glanced at Ruby as she reached for his empty glass. Like lazy maids who can't even clean a floor properly." The table laughed, a chorus of sycophantic chuckles. Ruby's face remained neutral, her hand steady as she replaced his wine. "Yes, sir," she murmured, and became invisible again. She cleared the first course, brought the second, refilled glasses, and retreated to the kitchen when dismissed. Through the swinging door, she could still hear them. Powerful men making plans, dividing territory, discussing death and money with equal indifference. None of them knew that the woman serving their dinner had led operations in 7 countries, that she'd coordinated strikes that toppled regimes, that every word they spoke was being memorized, catalogued, prepared for the intelligence apparatus that would eventually dismantle everything they'd built. They saw a maid, timid, subservient, unforgettable. They had no idea they were being hunted. Ruby washed dishes in the kitchen, her hands moving through hot water while her mind mapped exit routes, counted Roman's guards, and calculated response times. The intelligence was good tonight. Confirmation of the Odessa shipment, names of compromised officials, details about territorial disputes. But something else nagged at her. The nervousness in the room, the way Roman's head of security kept checking his phone, the underlying current of fear masked by bravado. Outside, distant thunder rumbled across the estate grounds. Or perhaps it wasn't thunder at all. The alarm started as a low pulse, almost musical, a sound designed not to panic guests but to alert the security team. Roman's hand froze halfway to his wine glass, his eyes cutting towards the hallway where his head of security had disappeared minutes earlier. "Probably just a sensor malfunction," he said, but his voice had lost its casual arrogance. "Deer trigger them constantly." Ruby was already moving towards the kitchen, her instincts screaming warnings her role couldn't acknowledge. She'd counted the seconds since the last perimeter check-in. 43 seconds overdue. In a professional operation, that meant the outer guards were already neutralized. The dining room conversations had stuttered to uncomfortable silence when the second alarm joined the first. This one sharper, more urgent. The shipping magnate pushed back from the table, his hand drifting toward his jacket. The councilman's face had gone pale. "Roman!" one of them started. The window exploded. As glass erupted inward in a crystalline wave, propelled by a 7.62mm round that had been fired from somewhere in the darkness beyond the estate grounds. The bullet caught Roman's bodyguard, the one who'd been standing beside the door, in the center of his chest. His body armor might have stopped a handgun, but this was a rifle round traveling at 2,800 feet per second. It punched through Kevlar and bone and exited in a spray of red that painted the Renaissance-era tapestry behind him. He was dead before he hit the marble. The second shot came a fraction of a second later, taking out the antique chandelier. 300 pounds of Murano glass and gilt bronze crashed onto the dinner table, scattering crystal shrapnel and extinguishing candles. Darkness swallowed the room, it broken only by the flicker of small fires where candles had rolled onto the Persian rug. Roman sat frozen, his brain struggling to process the transition from absolute power to mortal danger. Around him, his guests scattered like roaches when the light comes on. Some diving under the table, others scrambling toward the doors. Someone was screaming. Glass crunched under expensive shoes. Ruby moved. She crossed the 15 feet between the kitchen doorway and Roman's chair in less than 2 seconds, her body low, her trajectory calculated to use the overturned furniture as cover. A maid shouldn't move like this. A servant shouldn't have the spatial awareness to map a room's cover points or the physical capability to accelerate from stillness to full combat speed. But Ruby Rain hadn't been a maid for a very long time before she became one. She hit Roman at waist height, her shoulder driving into his ribs with enough force to knock him sideways out of his chair. They went down together, Ruby controlling their fall, twisting so she landed on the bottom, and Roman's 200 pounds didn't crush her against the floor. The third shot struck the chair where he'd been sitting, the round punching through mahogany and leather before embedding itself in the wall. "Stay down!" Ruby's voice cut through the chaos with a tone of command she immediately regretted. She softened it, added fear to mask the tactical assessment. "Please, sir, don't move." Roman was gasping beneath her, his mind trying to reconcile what had just happened. The meek maid who'd served his wine had just moved with the reflexes of a trained operator, and had just saved his life with a tackle that suggested combat experience. "What? How did you—" The fourth and fifth shots came almost simultaneously, walking across the room in a pattern designed to suppress movement. Professional work. Military precision. Ruby's mind catalogued the angle, the timing between shots, the deliberate destruction of the room's lighting. This wasn't a mob hit. This was a tactical assault by people who'd done this before. Outside, automatic weapons fire erupted, the distinctive chatter of AK pattern rifles answered by the heavier bark of Roman's guards returning fire. Except Ruby could count the defending weapons by their sound signatures. 3. Maybe 4. Roman had claimed 20 guards on the property. The rest were already dead. "We need to move," Ruby said, I still maintaining the trembling servant voice even as her eyes scanned the room for exits. "The kitchen. We can get to the panic room through the kitchen. Who the fuck are you?" Roman's hand had found her wrist in the darkness, gripping it hard enough to hurt. Not the grip of a man in shock, but of a predator whose instincts were kicking in. "You moved before the shot. How did you know?" Another explosion, this one closer, the front gate, judging by the sound. Breaching charges. The attackers were coming in hard and fast, overwhelming Roman's defenses through sheer violence and superior tactics. Ruby met his eyes in the flickering firelight, knowing her cover was already cracking, calculating how much truth would keep him cooperative. "I used to date a soldier. He taught me things. Please, Mr. Carrara." We need to move now. It was a thin lie, barely credible, but Roman's survival instincts overrode his suspicion. He released her wrist and started to rise. "Stay low," Ruby commanded, then caught herself. "Please, sir, the shooters might still see movement." They crawled towards the kitchen through broken glass and spilled wine, moving through a dining room that had been transformed from a display of wealth into a kill zone. Behind them, one of Roman's guests was sobbing, pinned under a section of the fallen chandelier. Another lay motionless near the door, though Ruby couldn't tell if he'd been shot or was simply hiding. The gunfire outside was intensifying, getting closer. Ruby could hear shouting in Russian now, coordinated assault commands that confirmed her worst assessment. The Iron Cartel hadn't just come to send a message. They'd come to erase Roman Carrara from existence. And Ruby was caught in the middle of a war zone with her extraction team still 3 minutes out. The kitchen was supposed to be safe. Roman had designed it that way. Reinforced walls, a single entrance that could be defended, steel shutters that could seal the windows. But safety was an illusion when half your security team was bleeding out in the gardens, and the other half was retreating toward the main house in disorganized panic. Ruby could hear it all through the kitchen's exterior door. The screaming, the gunfire, the wet, meaty sounds of bullets finding flesh. Roman pressed himself against the wall beside the industrial refrigerator, his tailored suit torn and dusty, his face flushed with a combination of rage and fear that probably hadn't touched him in 20 years. "Oh, where the fuck is Marco? Where's my security?" Ruby moved to the window, staying low, angling her view to see the grounds without exposing herself. What she saw confirmed what her ears had already told her. 3 of Roman's guards were making a fighting retreat towards the house, but they were outgunned and outmaneuvered. The attackers moved in fire teams, providing cover, advancing with textbook precision. Not mob soldiers, military contractors, maybe ex-Spetsnaz. And they were 30 seconds from the kitchen door. "They're coming," Ruby said quietly. Her hand moved to the tear in her uniform, where the fabric had ripped during the tackle, and she pulled, widening the split up the side to allow her legs full range of motion. The practical calculation of someone who knew she might need to fight or run. "Oh, what are you doing?" Roman stared at her like she'd lost her mind. Ruby ignored him, scanning the kitchen for anything useful. Her extraction was still 2 minutes out. She'd felt the vibration pattern of the coded alert on the fitness tracker hidden under her sleeve. 2 minutes might as well be 2 hours when professional killers were breaching your perimeter. The kitchen door burst open and Marco stumbled through, Roman's head of security, his left arm hanging useless and blood soaking through his shirt. Behind him, one of the younger guards, Tommy, who'd always been polite to Ruby, who'd told her about his daughter's quinceañera, half fell, half crawled across the threshold. Tommy wasn't going to see another quinceañera. The round had caught him in the abdomen, and the amount of blood spreading across the tile meant the wound was catastrophic. "Lock it down!" Marco shouted, slamming the door and throwing the deadbolt, as if a lock would stop what was coming. "Boss, we need to get you to the panic room. We need—" He saw Ruby and stopped, his professional assessment noting the torn uniform, the way she was standing, balanced, ready, completely unlike the timid maid he'd seen every day for 18 months. The window exploded inward, glass spraying across the kitchen as a fragmentation grenade bounced off the center island and skittered toward the pantry. Ruby's body moved before her mind finished processing. She grabbed the grenade mid-roll, her hands finding it like she'd done this 1,000 times, and hurled it back through the broken window in one fluid motion. The explosion outside lit up the kitchen in a brief, hellish orange glow. "Jesus Christ," Marco whispered. Ruby was already moving to Tommy, dropping to her knees beside him. "I need towels, clean ones, and the first aid kit from under the sink." "We don't have time for—" Marco started. "Get them now." The command came out with the full force of her real voice, the one that had ordered men into combat, and Marco's body responded to the authority before his brain caught up. He moved. But Ruby had already shifted focus, her eyes locked on the Glock 19 in Tommy's tactical holster. He was beyond needing it, his breathing shallow and rapid, his eyes starting to glaze. She reached for the weapon with her right hand while her left pressed against his abdomen, applying pressure she knew wouldn't save him, but might buy him minutes. I'm sorry," she whispered to Tommy, and she meant it. Then she pulled the Glock free. The weapon came up in a two-handed grip that was pure muscle memory, her thumbs aligned along the frame, her sight picture perfect despite the chaos. She conducted a press check, confirming a round was chambered, then dropped the magazine to verify the load. 15 rounds of Federal HST. She slapped the magazine home and racked the slide with a motion so practiced it was beautiful. The silence in the kitchen was absolute. Roman stared at her like she'd grown a second head. Marco had frozen halfway to the sink, the first aid kit forgotten. Even Tommy, dying on the floor, had focused his fading attention on the maid who moved like an operator. "Who the fuck are you?" Roman's voice was quiet now, dangerous. The fear had burned away, leaving only the predatory intelligence that had built his empire. Ruby didn't answer. She was counting. The grenade she'd thrown had bought them maybe 20 seconds. The attackers would regroup, reassess, come in harder. They'd use the side entrance, probably breach it with shaped charges since the windows had proven vulnerable. Her extraction team was 90 seconds out. She needed to keep Roman alive for 90 seconds. The side door buckled inward with a metallic shriek as the breaching charge detonated. 2 men in tactical gear poured through, their rifles up, laser sights cutting red lines through the smoke and dust. Ruby shot the first one twice, sent a mass, then once more as he fell. The second man was swinging his rifle toward her when she put 2 rounds through the triangle of his face, visible between helmet and vest. Both men dropped like puppets with cut strings. The Glock slide locked back, empty. Ruby executed a tactical reload without thinking, ejecting the spent magazine and seating a fresh one from the dead guard's belt carrier in less than 2 seconds. She didn't holster the weapon. She stood there in her torn maid's uniform and blood-splattered apron, a Glock 19 held in a competition-ready grip, 2 bodies cooling at her feet. Roman Carrara, the man who controlled half the criminal enterprises in the state, who'd built an empire on violence and fear, who'd humiliated her for 18 months, finally understood. The most dangerous person in his house had been cleaning it all along. Outside, the sound of helicopter rotors began to cut through the night. If you are still listening and you aren't subscribed yet, you are missing out on a whole lot. Smash that subscribe button now and like this video. Thank you for doing that, my friend. The helicopter sound was getting closer, but it wasn't the cavalry Ruby was hoping for. The rotor signature was wrong. A civilian bird, probably the attacker's extraction. Her team would come in military Black Hawks, and they were still 60 seconds out according to the pulse against her wrist. 60 seconds was an eternity when you were pinned down in a kitchen with bodies stacking up. "Marco, get away from that window!" Ruby's command came half a second before the suppressing fire started, rounds punching through the steel shutters in a rhythmic pattern designed to keep heads down. Marco threw himself flat, and Ruby could see the spreading bloodstain on his left side had grown substantially. The arm wound she'd initially catalogued wasn't his only injury. "Boss!" Marco gasped, his good hand pressed against his ribs. "Boss, I need to get you out. You're not getting anyone anywhere." Ruby moved toward him in a low crouch, the Glock still in her right hand, her eyes never leaving the multiple entry points the attackers could exploit. "Roman, I need you to cover that door. Anyone comes through that isn't me, you shoot them." She pulled the Glock 17 from Marco's hip holster and shoved it into Roman's hands. He took it automatically, his mind still trying to process the radical shift in his reality. The maid was giving him orders. The maid had just killed 2 men with the precision of a professional. The maid was moving through his kitchen like she owned it. I don't take orders from—" "You do now." Ruby cut him off, already focused on Marco. "Unless you want to die in your own kitchen because you're too arrogant to listen. Your choice." Roman's mouth worked soundlessly for a moment. Then he moved to the door, the weapon raised with the competence of a man who'd killed before, even if it had been years since he'd needed to. Ruby holstered her own weapon and turned her full attention to Marco. The security chief was going into shock, his breathing rapid and shallow, his skin taking on a greyish pallor that meant blood loss and organ damage. When she pulled his hand away from his side, blood welled up thick and dark. "How bad?" Marco asked, though his eyes already knew the answer. "Bad enough." Ruby's hands moved to his tactical vest, releasing the Velcro with practiced efficiency. "I need to see it. This is going to hurt." She peeled back the vest and cut away his shirt with a paring knife from the counter. The wound was worse than she'd feared, a through-and-through that had likely nicked his liver or spleen. The entrance wound was relatively small, but the exit had torn a hole the size of a golf ball through his back. Blood pumped out with each heartbeat. Too much blood, spreading across the white tile in an expanding pool. "I can't." Marco's voice was fading. "Can't feel my legs." "Stay with me, Marco." Ruby was already moving, grabbing kitchen towels from the drawer, discarding the decorative ones for the plain white cotton underneath. She needed something absorbent, something she could pack into the wound to create pressure from the inside. Tommy had stopped breathing 2 minutes ago, and she'd known he wouldn't make it, but Marco still had a chance if she could stop the bleeding long enough for real medical intervention. "This is going to hurt like hell," she warned, then began stuffing the towels into the exit wound. Marco screamed, his body arching off the floor. Ruby held him down with one hand while the other worked, packing the wound cavity with methodical efficiency. Blood soaked through the white cotton immediately, turning it crimson, flowing over her hands in hot pulses. Her apron, already splattered from the earlier violence, became a canvas of arterial spray. "Breathe through it, Marco. Stay conscious. I need you conscious." She packed more towels in, feeling for the source of the bleeding, applying pressure where it would do the most good. Her hands disappeared into his body cavity up to her knuckles, and searching by touch for the damaged vessel. The blood kept coming. So much blood. It covered her hands completely, ran down her forearms, soaked into the fabric of her uniform until the white apron was more red than white. She looked like a butcher, like something from a horror film, her arms crimson to the elbows. But her hands were steady. Jesus Christ! Roman breathed from his position by the door, watching the maid perform battlefield surgery on his kitchen floor. "Jesus fucking Christ, who are you?" Ruby didn't answer. She'd found it, a tear in what felt like the splenic artery. She applied direct pressure, holding it while her other hand packed more material around the wound. Marco had stopped screaming, his jaw locked, his teeth grinding so hard she could hear them. "Stay with me," she repeated, softer now. "You're doing good. Just stay with me." The suppressing fire outside had stopped. That was either very good or very bad. Ruby's tactical awareness screamed at her to move, to take a defensive position, but she couldn't let go of Marco's artery. If she released pressure now, he'd bleed out in under a minute. She was committed. The kitchen door exploded inward for the second time, the lock giving way under a boot. Roman fired twice, wildly, and Ruby heard someone grunt and fall back. But there would be more. There were always more. "Roman, reload!" She could hear the slide locked back on his Glock. "Magazine release, drop it. Fresh mag from Marco's vest, slam it home." To his credit, Roman moved without hesitation, his hands finding the spare magazines by touch. Whatever else he was a survivor. Outside, a new sound cut through the chaos. Deeper rotors, military-grade turbines. The real cavalry had arrived, but they were still on the wrong side of 30 seconds and a kitchen full of killers. Ruby's hands stayed buried in Marco's wound, holding his life inside him through pressure and sheer will, her white apron now a testament to the violence she'd been hiding behind submission and silence. The blood kept flowing, warm and endless, and Ruby kept working. Because that's what operators did. They kept working until the job was done or they were dead. The Blackhawks came in low and fast, their approach masked by the terrain, until they were practically on top of the estate. Roman heard them first as a deep vibration that made the remaining glassware rattle in the cabinets, then as a thunderous roar that drowned out even the gunfire outside. "They brought helicopters," he said, his voice cracking slightly. The man who'd survived 2 decades in the criminal underworld by being smarter and more vicious than everyone else was finally facing something bigger than his empire. "They brought fucking military helicopters to kill me." Ruby didn't correct him. Her hands were still inside Marco, maintaining pressure on the artery, while her mind calculated angles and response times. 2 Blackhawks, judging by the rotor signatures. Standard insertion loadout would be 12 operators total. Against maybe 6 remaining cartel hitters, the math was about to shift dramatically. But Roman didn't know they were here for her. The first helicopter thundered directly over the mansion, at close enough that the downdraft rattled the broken shutters. Ruby could hear the fast rope insertion, the metallic zip of operators sliding down braided cord, boots hitting ground in rapid succession. Professional, efficient, beautiful. "We're fucked," Roman said flatly. "We're completely fucked. The feds finally—" The gunfire that erupted outside wasn't the sporadic exchange of a firefight. It was a massacre set to music. The suppressed weapons made a sound like industrial staplers, sharp metallic coughs that punctuated screams and the clatter of bodies hitting pavement. Ruby counted the rhythm of it, the coordinated fire teams engaging targets with overlapping fields of fire. The cartel contractors had walked into a meat grinder operated by people who'd perfected the art of close-quarters battle in places like Fallujah and Abbottabad. The sky had lasted maybe 20 seconds. Then silence, broken only by the idling rotors and someone shouting tactical commands in English. "Clear left. 2 down, moving to the south garden. Contact, 1 shooter retreating toward the main house." A short burst of suppressed fire, then. Threat neutralized. Roman was staring at the door, his stolen Glock raised but trembling slightly. He'd built his empire on violence, but this was a different kind of violence. Clinical, efficient, overwhelming. The kind of violence nations employed when they wanted problems erased. "They're clearing the grounds," Ruby said quietly, still maintaining pressure on Marco's wound. The security chief had lost consciousness about 30 seconds ago, but his pulse was still present under her fingertips. Thready, weak, but there. "They'll be here soon." "Who?" Roman turned to look at her, and for the first time since she'd known him, she saw genuine fear in his eyes. "Who the fuck brings Navy SEALs to a mob hit?" Ruby didn't answer. She was listening to the tactical chatter getting closer, the operators moving through the mansion with methodical precision. They'd be checking each room, clearing threats, establishing security. Standard operating procedure for a high-value extraction in a hostile environment. The question was whether Roman would still be breathing when they walked into this kitchen. "Kitchen entrance, north side?" A voice called from somewhere nearby. "Reading heat signatures inside. Multiple bodies. At least 1 still mobile." "Copy. Approaching with caution. Could be hostile." Roman's finger tightened on the trigger, his survival instincts warring with his tactical sense. "If they come through that door, you'll die." Ruby's voice cut through his panic with absolute certainty. "You're good, Roman. Maybe even great by mob standards. But those men outside, they eat people like you for breakfast in countries you can't pronounce. If you point that weapon at them, you'll be dead before you finish pulling the trigger. Then what the fuck do I do? You wait, Ruby said, and you let me handle this. She could hear them now, boots on tile, the slight creak of tactical gear. Multiple operators, moving in synchronized silence. The door was still partially blocked by the bodies of the cartel men Ruby had killed, but that would slow them down maybe 3 seconds. Coming in, a voice announced, weapons tight, possible civilian casualties. The door swung open, and 3 shapes moved through it like liquid darkness. All black tactical gear, suppressed weapons, night vision mounted but flipped up. They flowed into the kitchen with the coordinated precision of people who'd trained together for thousands of hours, each one covering a different sector, their movements a deadly ballet. The lead operator's weapon swept across Roman, then Marco, then locked on to Ruby. She was kneeling in a pool of blood, her white apron soaked crimson, her hands buried in a dying man's chest cavity. She looked like a nightmare, like something from a horror film, backlit by the kitchen's flickering overhead lights. But she wasn't reaching for a weapon. Her hands were occupied with the more important work of keeping a man alive. The operator's stance shifted slightly. Recognition, not of her face, but of what she was doing. Combat first aid, trauma care, the universal language of people who'd seen too much death. Clear, he called, lowering his weapon slightly. Civilians providing medical assistance, 1 critical, 1 ambulatory. His eyes swept the dead cartel contractors. Tango's down. Appears the occupants defended themselves. The other 2 operators moved past him, securing the kitchen's other entrances, professional and thorough. The team leader stepped closer, his weapon now pointing at the floor, his eyes taking in the scene with the analytical precision of someone reading a tactical after-action report. He looked at the body positions, the spent brass, the surgical precision of Ruby's headshots. Then he looked at Ruby. Really looked, and she saw the moment recognition hit him. Not her face, which would be meaningless to him, but something else. The way she'd positioned herself. The tactical efficiency of the kill shots. The professional medical intervention. All the small details that screamed military training to someone who knew what to look for. "Mom," he said carefully, his tone shifting from tactical commander to something approaching reverence. "Are you injured?" "The blood's not mine," Ruby answered, her voice still carrying the false timidity of her cover, but fraying at the edges. "This man needs immediate evacuation, splenic artery damage, massive hemorrhage. I've got pressure on it, but he's lost too much blood." The team leader keyed his radio. "Medevac to my position. Priority 1. Critical trauma." He paused, then added, "And somebody get the lieutenant. Now." Roman was staring between Ruby and the operators like he'd fallen into an alternate dimension. What the fuck is happening?" Nobody answered him, because the real question wasn't what was happening, it was who Ruby Rain actually was, and that answer was about to walk through the door. The lieutenant entered the kitchen the way apex predators enter anywhere, with absolute confidence and zero hesitation. He was taller than the others, broader through the shoulders, with the kind of presence that made everyone in a room recalibrate their threat assessments. His tactical gear was identical to his team's, but he wore it like a second skin, like someone who'd spent more time in combat zones than civilization. Roman saw him and immediately raised his hands, the Glock dangling from one finger by the trigger guard in the universal sign of surrender. Whatever criminal arrogance he'd maintained had finally crumbled under the weight of professional violence. He was smart enough to know when he'd lost. "I'm unarmed," Roman said quickly. "I'm cooperating. Whatever you want, I'll—" The lieutenant walked past him like he didn't exist. Not past him with acknowledgement, not past him with tactical awareness, past him with the complete dismissal of someone navigating around furniture. Roman Carrara, the man who controlled half the state's criminal infrastructure, the man federal agencies had been trying to bring down for 15 years, might as well have been wallpaper. The lieutenant's attention was locked on the blood-soaked figure kneeling on the kitchen floor. Ruby's hands were still buried in Marco's chest cavity, her arms crimson to the elbows, her white apron transformed into a gore-splattered canvas that would have looked at home in a trauma bay. Her hair had come loose from its severe bun, strands stuck to her face with sweat and blood spatter. She looked like she'd fought her way through hell. She looked like exactly what she was. The lieutenant stopped 3 feet from her and came to rigid attention. His right hand snapped up in a salute so crisp, so precise, it could have been pulled from a parade ground. The gesture was incongruous in the destroyed kitchen, surrounded by dead bodies and the smell of gunpowder and blood. "Mom." His voice carried the kind of respect reserved for generals and Medal of Honor recipients. "Extraction is ready. Command is yours." The kitchen went absolutely silent. Ruby didn't look up immediately. She was adjusting her grip on Marco's artery, making sure the pressure was maintained, that the packing would hold when she transferred care. But when she finally raised her eyes to meet the lieutenant's, something fundamental shifted in her bearing. The submissive maid vanished. What replaced her was something Roman had never seen before, a warrior so thoroughly baptized in violence that it had become a second language. Her eyes were cold, analytical, carrying the weight of decisions that had shaped geopolitics and ended lives by the hundreds. "Casualty assessment," Ruby said, and her voice had dropped half an octave, shedding the servile timidity like a snake shedding skin. It was a command voice now, the kind that expected immediate compliance and received it. "Kitchen secure, Ma'am. Estate perimeter locked down. 6 enemy KIA, no friendly casualties." The lieutenant kept his salute, waiting for her acknowledgement. "2 Blackhawks on station, full medical team on Bird 2. We have a clean extract corridor, but it's degrading. Local law enforcement is 7 minutes out." Ruby nodded once, processing the tactical picture with the speed of someone who'd commanded operations across multiple theaters. Her hands began the delicate process of transferring care, guiding one of the medics who'd appeared in the doorway through the exact pressure points, the angle of the packing, the precarious balance keeping Marco alive. "This man is priority medical," she said. "Splenic artery compromise, approximately 2 liters blood loss, showing signs of hypovolemic shock. He gets on Bird 2 with the trauma team, and he gets there now." "Yes, ma'am." The medic took over smoothly, his hands replacing Ruby's with professional efficiency. Ruby stood, pulling her blood-soaked hands free from Marco's body. She looked down at herself, at the ruined maid's uniform, the apron that was more red than white, her arms painted in drying blood. For a moment something flickered across her face. Regret, maybe. Or just exhaustion. Then she returned the lieutenant's salute with equal precision. "At ease, Lieutenant." Her hand came down and she wiped her palms on what was left of her apron, a futile gesture that only smeared the blood around. "Sitrep on the primary objective." "Package is secure, ma'am. The documents were exactly where you indicated, estate office. Behind the false panel. We've got 6 terabytes of financial records, communication logs, and enough evidence to dismantle 3 trafficking networks and implicate 14 sitting officials." He allowed himself the ghost of a smile. "Hell of a job, Commander." Commander. The word hung in the air like a grenade with the pin pulled. Roman's hands were still raised, but his face had gone through confusion and landed somewhere between shock and existential horror. He was staring at Ruby, at Commander Rain, like she'd just revealed herself to be a completely different species. "You..." His voice came out strangled. "You were here for 18 months. 18 fucking months in my house, serving my dinner, cleaning my floors. I treated you like... Like a servant? Ruby met his eyes, and there was no warmth there, no forgiveness. Yes, you did. And I let you. Because that's what deep cover means, Roman. It means enduring whatever keeps the mission intact. She paused. It means watching you traffic children and women, listening to you order murders, serving wine while you planned operations that destroyed lives, and documenting every single word. The color drained from Roman's face as the full scope of his situation finally crystallized. This wasn't a raid. This wasn't even an arrest. This was the conclusion of an intelligence operation that had been running under his roof for a year and a half, conducted by someone so far above his weight class it was almost funny. Almost. The Bratva hit wasn't random, was it? Roman's voice was hollow. You knew they were coming. You used me as bait. The Iron Cartel. Ruby corrected. And I didn't know they were coming tonight. That was unfortunate timing. She glanced at the bodies of the attackers she'd killed. Though it did accelerate my extraction timeline considerably. The lieutenant cleared his throat. Mum, we really should move. Local LEOs are getting closer, and while we have jurisdictional authority, I'd rather avoid the paperwork. Ruby nodded, then looked at Roman one last time. He was still standing there with his hands up, a man whose entire reality had been dismantled in the span of 20 minutes. His empire was about to fall, not from rival gangs or federal prosecutors, but from the quiet woman who'd scrubbed his toilets. For what it's worth, Ruby said, her voice softer now, almost human again. Marco's a good man. He doesn't deserve what you've made him part of. I hope he makes it. Then she turned to the lieutenant. Let's go home. She walked toward the door, and the operators parted for her like water, their weapons lowered, their postures respectful. Commander Ruby Rain, still wearing a maid's uniform and covered in blood, strode through the wreckage of Roman Carrara's kitchen with her head high. Behind her, Roman finally lowered his hands. He'd built an empire on knowing who to fear. He'd just learned he'd been living with a legend and treating her like furniture. Ruby stepped through the kitchen door and into the grand foyer, and with each step the transformation became more complete. The apologetic slouch straightened into a military bearing. The downcast eyes lifted to sweep the tactical landscape with predatory assessment. By the time she reached the center of the blood-spattered marble she'd scrubbed that morning, Ruby Rain the Maid had ceased to exist entirely. Commander Rain had taken the field. Lieutenant, I need a full disposition of remaining hostiles. Her voice carried across the foyer with the kind of authority that didn't ask for compliance. It assumed it. And someone get me a weapon that isn't empty. One of the SEALs immediately produced a compact M4 carbine, press-checking it before handing it over. Ruby accepted it with the casual familiarity of someone who'd carried similar weapons through a dozen countries, her hands moving through the functions check automatically. 2 remaining hostiles confirmed, ma'am, the lieutenant reported, pulling up a tablet that showed thermal imaging from the Black Hawk sensors. Both have retreated to the east wing, 2nd floor. They're dug in, covering the main staircase. Good position. They can hold that corridor indefinitely against a frontal assault. Ruby studied the display for 3 seconds, her mind overlaying her 18 months of domestic knowledge onto the tactical situation. She knew every room in this mansion, every corridor, every servant's entrance and hidden passage that Roman's own guards had probably forgotten existed. They're in the gallery, she said. Roman keeps his art collection there. Reinforced walls, limited entry points. They probably think it's defensible. She looked up at the lieutenant. It's not. There's a service elevator behind the west pantry that opens directly into the gallery's storage room. They won't be watching it. How do you... The lieutenant caught himself. And of course she knew. She'd probably cleaned that elevator 100 times. Movement on the main staircase drew Ruby's attention. 3 of Roman's surviving guards were descending, weapons drawn, their faces showing the confusion of men who'd watched their secure world explode. The lead guard, Vincent, who'd made crude jokes about Ruby's appearance, who'd once kicked over her mop bucket for fun, stopped short when he saw the SEALs. "Drop your weapons." Vincent's rifle came up, pointing at the nearest operator. "Federal agents or not, this is private property and—" "Stand down." Ruby's command cracked through the air like a whip. Vincent's head whipped toward her, his eyes widening as he tried to reconcile the blood-soaked Maid with the woman giving orders to Navy SEALs. His rifle wavered, uncertainty written across his face. "Ruby? What the hell is—" "I said stand down, Vincent." Ruby's voice dropped to something cold and lethal. "You've got two choices right now. You can lower that weapon and follow my orders, or you can find out what happens when you point a rifle at a SEAL team. Spoiler, it ends with your mother getting a folded flag." The casual certainty in her voice, the absolute confidence that she could back up that threat, made Vincent's survival instincts override his confusion. The rifle lowered. Smart man. Ruby shifted her attention back to the tactical situation, her mind already 3 moves ahead. "Vincent, you've got 2 hostiles pinned in the East Wing gallery. How many other guards do you have mobile?" 3? Maybe 4. Vincent looked like his brain was actively short-circuiting. "Ruby, I don't understand." "You don't need to understand. You need to follow orders." Ruby pointed at the lieutenant. "This is Lieutenant Morrison. You're going to coordinate with him. Use your knowledge of the estate's security systems to our advantage. Can you access the gallery's environmental controls from here?" Vincent nodded dumbly. "Yeah, the whole system runs through the main security office." "Good. Lieutenant, I want suppressing fire on that staircase. Enough to keep them pinned, but not enough to make them desperate. Vincent, you're going to kill the lights in the East Wing and pump the HVAC full of smoke. We're going to make them think we're coming through the front while we actually hit them from behind." She was moving now, already heading toward the west corridor, the M4 held in a low, ready position. "I'll take 2 operators and use the service route. Give us 90 seconds to get in position, then start your diversion." "Ma'am." The lieutenant's voice carried a note of concern. "With respect, you've been under deep cover for 18 months. Maybe let the team handle the breach while you coordinate from—" Ruby stopped and looked back at him. The expression on her face wasn't anger. It was the patient tolerance of a teacher correcting a student who should know better. "Lieutenant Morrison, how many confirmed kills do you have?" "Ma'am, I don't think that's—" "Humor me." Morrison straightened slightly. 37 confirmed, ma'am." Ruby's smile was cold. "I stopped counting at 200. Now pick 2 of your best and try to keep up." She didn't wait for a response, and already moving through the mansion with the confidence of someone who knew every shadow and corner. 2 SEALs fell in behind her, younger men with the hungry efficiency of operators still building their reputations. Behind them, Vincent finally found his voice. "What the fuck just happened?" "That," Morrison said, watching Commander Rain disappear into the servants' corridor, "is what a real operator looks like. Now get me those lights." Ruby moved through the narrow service passages with fluid grace, the M4 tracking with her eyes, her breathing controlled. The 2 operators behind her maintained perfect tactical spacing, but she could feel their evaluation, watching to see if the desk jockey commander could still move like a shooter. She'd show them. The service elevator rose silently, and its mechanism maintained by the same meticulous attention to detail that had characterized her entire cover. When it stopped on the 2nd floor, Ruby held up a closed fist, the universal signal for halt. Through the wall, muffled by layers of drywall and insulation, she could hear the 2 hostiles. They were speaking Russian, their voices tense but confident. They thought they were safe. They thought the hard part was over. They were about to learn what happened when you attacked an operation Commander Ruby Rain had spent 18 months building. The lights throughout the mansion died, plunging everything into darkness. A moment later, smoke began hissing through the vents. Ruby smiled in the dark. "Breach in 10. She whispered. "Fast and clean, no survivors." Because that's what legends did. They finished the job. I'm reminding you again, if you have reached this point and you aren't subscribed, you are missing out. The two hostiles in the gallery died quickly and quietly, their confidence shattered along with Ruby's breaching charge. She cleared the room with mechanical precision, double-tapping both targets before they could transition from defensive positions to engagement. The SEALs behind her barely had time to acquire targets before it was over. "Clear," Ruby announced, already moving toward the gallery's main entrance. Through the smoke and darkness, she could hear Morrison's team advancing up the main staircase, the diversion having served its purpose. But Ruby's tactical sense, honed across a dozen war zones and countless operations, was screaming that something was wrong. She keyed the radio she'd taken from one of the operators. "Morrison, status on perimeter security." "Locked down tight, ma'am. Nothing moving on thermals except—" He paused, and Ruby heard the change in his voice. "Scratch that. Single heat signature approaching the main gate on foot. Confident posture, no weapon visible." Ruby was already running, her boots silent on the carpet she'd vacuumed countless times. She knew what this was, had seen it before in Mogadishu, in Ramadi, in half a dozen cities whose names were still classified. The tactical assault had failed, which meant the cartel was moving to their contingency plan. Decapitation. Send in the best they had, the one operator worth 10 normal soldiers, and let him finish the job personally. She hit the main staircase at a full sprint, taking the steps 3 at a time, and the M4 now slung across her back because she knew how this would end. The grand foyer opened before her, 2 stories of marble and crystal that represented everything Roman Carrara thought made him powerful. Ruby had polished every inch of it, had made it gleam like a temple to criminal excess. Now she was going to paint it red. The front doors stood open, blown off their hinges by the earlier breaching charges. Through them walked a man who moved like violence given human form. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing civilian clothes that couldn't quite hide the tactical gear underneath. But it was his eyes that told the real story. Flat, emotionless, the eyes of someone who'd done this so many times it had become routine. He saw Ruby and smiled. The famous Commander Rain. His English carried a thick Chechen accent. "They said you were here, hiding like mouse. I told them, no, the Wraith does not hide. She hunts." He spread his arms, a gesture of mock welcome. "So we send wolves to find wolf, and here you are." Ruby descended the last few steps slowly, her hands visible and empty. Behind her, she could hear the SEALs taking positions, but she raised one hand in a gesture that meant hold. This was hers. "You have a name?" Ruby asked, her voice conversational as she walked across the marble she'd scrubbed on her hands and knees. "Dmitry Volkov." He said it with pride. "Former Spetsnaz Alpha Group. 16 years fighting NATO dogs in places you Americans pretend do not exist." His smile widened. "I have heard stories about you. Kandahar, the safe house in Karachi. The thing you did in Belarus that made grown men wake up screaming. Then you know how this ends. Da, one of us dies tonight." Dimitri's hands moved to his sides, adopting a fighting stance that spoke of Sistema training and real-world application. "But I think maybe your reputation is bigger than reality. Maybe you are just woman playing dress-up soldier." Ruby stopped 15 feet away from him, her body language relaxed, but her weight balanced. "Last chance to walk away, Dmitri." "I do not walk away. Neither do I." Dmitri moved first, closing the distance with the explosive speed of a trained fighter. His opening combination was textbook Sistema. flowing strikes designed to overwhelm through constant pressure and unpredictable angles. He was good, maybe even great by conventional standards. But Ruby Rain hadn't stayed alive in the world's worst places by being conventional. She slipped his first strike by millimeters, redirected his second with a subtle wrist deflection that used his momentum against him, and when he committed to a third, a potentially devastating elbow strike, she was already inside his guard. The environment told the story of what happened next. Ruby had spent 18 months learning every surface, every angle, every potential weapon in this mansion. She knew the exact height of the ornate side table to her left, knew that Roman's hideous bronze sculpture was precisely weighted to serve as a fulcrum. She used Dimitri's forward momentum to drive him backward into the table. His knee buckled against the hard edge, not broken, but compromised. The sculpture came off its pedestal in her hands, for 12 pounds of Art Nouveau excess that she swung in a tight arc that ended at Dimitri's temple. The Russian got his arm up in time to partially block it, but the impact still staggered him. Ruby didn't give him time to recover. She dropped the sculpture and transitioned to close-quarters combat, her strikes targeted at joints and nerve clusters with surgical precision. Dimitri was tough, she'd give him that. He absorbed punishment that would have dropped most men and kept fighting, his training and experience keeping him dangerous even as blood poured from a split above his eye. But Ruby had been fighting men like him since before he'd enlisted. She'd survived Kandahar by being faster, smarter, and more willing to do whatever it took to win. She wasn't trying to beat him in a fair fight. She was trying to end him. The opening came when Dimitri threw a desperate haymaker, committing too much weight forward. Ruby ducked under it, came up inside his guard, and drove her elbow into his floating ribs with enough force to crack bone. He gasped, his body betraying him for just a fraction of a second. That was all she needed. Ruby's hand found the knife sheathed at the small of Dimitri's back, his own weapon, which made this poetic justice. She drew it in one fluid motion and drove it upward between his ribs at the precise angle to find his heart. Dimitri's eyes went wide, shock replacing the professional confidence. He tried to speak, but blood bubbled from his lips instead of words. "You were good," Ruby said quietly, supporting his weight as he collapsed. But good isn't enough when you're hunting legends." She lowered him to the marble floor, the same floor she'd cleaned 100 times, now stained with the blood of the man sent to kill her. Around the foyer, the SEALs maintained their positions, weapons ready but unnecessary. The fight had lasted maybe 20 seconds. Ruby straightened, wiping the blade on her ruined apron before dropping it beside Dimitri's body. She looked up at Morrison, who was staring at her with something approaching awe. "Estate is clear," she said, her breathing barely elevated. "Let's get Marco to medical and prep for extraction. We're done here." Morrison nodded slowly. "Mom, that was what 18 months of mopping floors earns you," Ruby interrupted. "Complete knowledge of your environment and a really bad attitude about people who underestimate the help." She walked past Dimitri's body without a second glance, heading toward the kitchen where Marco was being stabilized. Behind her, the grand foyer of the Carrara estate stood as testament to the truth Roman had learned too late. The most dangerous weapon in any room isn't the gun or the knife. It's the person everyone overlooks. The smoke was clearing when Ruby walked back through the kitchen one last time. The medics had Marco stabilized on a stretcher, IV lines running, his vitals weak but present. He'd live, probably. The thought gave her more satisfaction than it should have. He'd been complicit in Roman's empire, had turned a blind eye to horrors that would haunt her for years. But he'd also been kind to her in small ways, a nod of acknowledgement, a quiet thank you when she'd brought him coffee during long nights. In this business, you learned to appreciate the small mercies. Roman was still in the kitchen, sitting on the floor with his back against the industrial refrigerator, looking like a man who'd watched his entire world-view collapse in real time. His expensive suit was ruined, torn and stained with the detritus of violence. His hands were shaking slightly. Adrenaline crash, probably, mixed with the psychological trauma of realizing he'd been living with a predator for 18 months. Ruby walked past him toward the counter where the evening's formal dinner still sat half-finished, an absurd monument to the normalcy that had existed just an hour ago. Among the scattered plates and overturned wine glasses, she found what she was looking for, one of Roman's prized silk napkins, imported from Milan, monogrammed with his initials in gold thread. He'd once screamed at her for 20 minutes because she'd used one to clean up a minor wine spill. She picked it up with her blood-soaked hands, the crimson immediately staining the pristine white silk. Roman watched her, his eyes tracking the deliberate desecration of something he'd valued. "That's yours," Ruby finished, wiping her hands thoroughly, grinding the blood into the expensive fabric with methodical precision. "I know. I've washed about 100 of them." She dropped the ruined napkin on the counter. "Consider it a souvenir." The Black Hawk's rotors were spinning up outside, the sound building to that distinctive chopping thunder that meant it was time to leave. And Ruby could see it through the shattered windows, a dark shape against the night sky, her ride home after the longest 18 months of her career. Morrison appeared in the doorway. "Ma'am, bird's ready. We need to be wheels up before local PD arrives. The federal liaison is already running interference, but our window is closing." Ruby nodded, then paused. There was something unfinished here, some need to mark the end of this chapter properly. She turned back to Roman, who was struggling to his feet, using the refrigerator for support. He looked at her, really looked at her, for perhaps the first time since she'd arrived at his estate. Not at the maid, not at the servant, but at the woman who'd dismantled his security, saved his life, and turned his mansion into a graveyard for the people who'd come to kill him. Who are you?" His voice was hoarse, stripped of its usual arrogance. "Really, not Ruby Rain. That's not a real name. Who the fuck are you?" Ruby considered the question, weighing operational security against the human impulse to be known, to be seen. She'd spent 18 months being invisible, 18 months swallowing her pride and her identity, 18 months being less than she was. Maybe she owed herself the truth, even if Roman didn't deserve it. "Commander Ruby Rain, Naval Special Warfare Development Group." She said it quietly, without pride or boast, just stating fact. "The Wraith, if you believe the stories. And before you ask, yes, Kandahar was real. Karachi was real. Belarus was real. All of it." Roman's face went through several expressions before settling on something between fear and grudging respect. And the Maid thing?" "Deep cover operation. 18 months of documentation, intelligence gathering, and watching you build a criminal empire while I cleaned your toilets." She smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You made it easy, honestly. You talked about everything in front of me because you genuinely didn't believe servants were real people. The files you took, everything." Ruby cut him off. "Financial records, communications, operational details. Enough to bring down your organization and about a dozen others. The FBI will be here within the hour, and they're going to have a very detailed roadmap of everywhere you've been and everyone you've corrupted." She paused. "You're done, Roman." He absorbed this with the stunned acceptance of a man who'd run out of options. "Why save me? If you're taking me down anyway, why not just let them kill me?" It was a fair question. Ruby had asked herself the same thing in the moment when she'd tackled him out of the sniper's line of fire. "Because I'm not an executioner," she said finally. "And because you dying would have been too easy. You get to live with what comes next, the trials, the testimony, watching everything you built get torn apart piece by piece. You get to spend the rest of your life in a federal prison knowing that the quiet maid you mocked is the reason you're there. The Black Hawk's engines reached full power, the sound demanding her attention. Ruby started toward the door, then stopped and looked back one more time. The nuclear codes, by the way, the ones you didn't know you had in that shipment from Odessa? We got those too. So, in addition to ruining your life, you also accidentally helped prevent a potential nuclear incident. She shrugged. You're welcome, I suppose. Roman's mouth worked soundlessly, his mind trying to process yet another revelation. Ruby didn't wait for a response. She walked through the kitchen door and out into the garden, her boots crunching on broken glass and spent brass. The Black Hawk sat on Roman's perfect lawn, its rotors turning the carefully manicured grass into a chaotic whirlwind. The SEALs had already loaded Marco and were waiting for her, professional and ready. "Ma'am!" Roman's voice called from behind her, raw and desperate. "Who are you? Really?" Ruby stopped at the helicopter's door and looked back at the mansion, at the broken windows and bullet-scarred walls, at the man standing in the doorway of his ruined empire. She smiled. "Just the help!" she called back, her voice barely audible over the rotors. Then she climbed into the Black Hawk, Morrison right behind her. The crew chief slid the door shut, sealing her away from Roman Carrara and his world. Through the window she could see him standing there, a small figure growing smaller as the helicopter lifted off. The estate fell away beneath them, the gardens she'd tended, the floors she'd scrubbed, the mansion where she'd been invisible for 18 months. Ruby watched it all recede into the darkness, feeling the weight of the operation finally lifting from her shoulders. "Hell of a job, Mom," Morrison said over the internal comms. 18 months is a long time to maintain deep cover. Ruby leaned her head back against the bulkhead, her exhaustion finally catching up with her now that the adrenaline was fading. It was necessary. Was it worth it? She thought about that, about the children whose trafficking routes they'd documented, the corruption they'd exposed, the nuclear materials they'd intercepted. She thought about the cost, the parts of herself she'd had to suppress, the daily humiliation she'd endured. "Ask me in a few years," Ruby said quietly. The Black Hawk banked east, climbing into the night sky, carrying Commander Ruby Rain away from the longest 18 months of her life. Below, she could see the flashing lights of police cars converging on the Carrara estate, arriving to find a crime lord and a story he'd never be able to fully tell, because who would believe that his downfall had come from the quiet woman who'd scrubbed his floors? Who would believe that legends sometimes hide in plain sight, wearing aprons and carrying mop buckets? Ruby closed her eyes and let the helicopter's vibration lull her toward something like peace. The Wraith was going home. Roman stood in the ruins of his estate as dawn broke over the horizon, painting the devastation in shades of gold and crimson. Federal agents swarmed through every room now, cataloging evidence, photographing bodies, dismantling his empire one seized document at a time. He'd called his lawyer. It hadn't helped. In the administrative office, barely touched by the violence that had consumed the rest of the mansion, Roman found the filing cabinet where he kept personnel records. His hands were steadier now, the shock converting into something harder, more survivable. And he pulled open the drawer labeled Household Staff and flipped through until he found it. Rain, Ruby, Maid, hired 18 months ago. He opened the file. The first page was her employment application, perfectly mundane, references he'd never bothered to check, a background that had seemed unremarkable precisely because it was designed to be. But as he turned the pages, looking for something, anything that should have warned him, the documents became increasingly sparse. Then they stopped entirely. Whole sections were missing. Her previous employment history, redacted. Her educational background, redacted. Even her emergency contact information had been blacked out with such thoroughness that not even a phone number remained visible. The last page was a single line stamped in red ink. Classified, unauthorized access prohibited. DoD Directive 5240.1. Roman stared at it, the final piece clicking into place. He'd been living with a Department of Defense asset. Not just any asset, something important enough to warrant classification protocols that superseded normal background checks, that could infiltrate his organization with documentation so perfect it had fooled his security chief. He'd been living with a legend and treated her like furniture. Vincent appeared in the doorway, his face haggard. "Boss, the feds want to never speak of her." Roman's voice was quiet but absolute. "The maid, Ruby, whatever her real name was, we never speak of her again. Not to the feds, not to each other, not to anyone. Understood?" Vincent nodded slowly, recognizing the tone. And it wasn't anger. It was something far more primal. It was fear. Roman closed the file and slipped it into his jacket. Let the federal agents have everything else, the financial records, the communications, the evidence of his empire. This he would keep. A reminder that the most dangerous enemies were the ones you never saw coming. The ones who smiled and said, "Yes, sir," while planning your destruction. The ones who cleaned your floors and listened to every word. Through the window, Roman could see the last of the Black Hawks disappearing into the morning sky, carrying away the ghost who'd haunted his mansion for 18 months. Commander Ruby Rain, the Wraith, just the help. A week later, Roman stood in his study, the one room the federal seizure hadn't touched yet. The repairs had been swift, efficient, at erasing the physical evidence of that night. But some things couldn't be repaired. He looked at the corner where Ruby used to kneel, scrubbing the baseboards he'd demanded be spotless. He'd walked past that spot 1,000 times, never once meeting her eyes, never once seeing her as anything more than a function. The silence in the room wasn't boring anymore. It was heavy with ghosts. Roman Carrara learned the hard way that silence is not weakness. In the world of tactical strategy, there is a concept known as the grey man, the art of blending in so perfectly that you become invisible. Ruby didn't survive because she was the loudest in the room. She survived because she was the most observant. The story of the maid and the mobster teaches us a critical lesson in situational awareness and humility. Never underestimate someone based on their station in life. The person you ignore today might be the only one capable of saving you tomorrow. True power doesn't need to announce itself. It simply waits. Roman still had his estate, though the federal charges would likely take that too. He still had his reputation, though it was now synonymous with the man who'd been infiltrated for 18 months by a maid. But he'd lost the only person who'd been truly loyal. Loyal not to him, but to something greater. Was it worth the ego? The empty corner provided no answer. Only silence.